Officer Sarah Rogers wiped the drizzle off her windshield as she pulled out of the Riverfalls Police Department parking lot. It was nearly 10 p.m., and she was starting her overnight patrol a bit later than usual, thanks to a last-minute briefing. Riverfalls, a small town tucked away near Oregon's scenic foothills, usually rested quietly at night. Most residents were in bed by 9, leaving the streets eerily empty under the faint glow of sporadic streetlights. Sarah had grown up here, knew every diner, every vintage store, and every local rumor that circulated among the town's close-knit residents. She loved Riverfalls for its tight community bonds, even if the place felt a bit isolated from the rest of the world. On slow nights like this, her main tasks included checking on vacant lots for trespassers, ensuring no drunk drivers were on the roads, and occasionally responding to domestic disturbances. After running through the routine, radio checks, license plate reader calibrations, and a quick chat with the dispatcher about possible trouble spots, Sarah eased her squad car onto Main Street. The autumn air was crisp, the sky mostly clouded over, and a gentle wind tugged at the final leaves clinging to the tall maples lining the roads. A subdued hush lay over the town, broken only by the purr of her engine. Around 11:30 p.m., she received a dispatch call about a vehicle reported parked suspiciously near the entrance of Westbrook Park, which was closed after dusk. Parks in Riverfalls weren't usually high-risk zones, but break-ins and petty vandalism had increased lately. Adjusting her route, Sarah headed toward the park, focusing on the beam of her headlights that cut through the dark, wet road. Suddenly, something small and unmoving reflected the headlights. She slowed, squinted, and realized there was a tiny owl right in the middle of the lane. It was perched in a tense, hunched position, looking very out of place. Sarah's heart gave a small jolt of alarm. Was it hurt? Lost? She flicked on the cruiser's hazard lights, carefully pulling over to the shoulder. The owl appeared motionless except for the subtle swivel of its head, reflecting back the glow of the headlights with large, round eyes. Sarah turned off the engine to avoid startling the bird further, then radioed dispatch. "Dispatch, this is Officer Rogers. I'll be delayed a few minutes, got an injured owl on the road up ahead." The dispatcher's voice crackled in with cautious amusement. Copy that, Rogers. Did you say an owl?" "Affirmative," Sarah replied. "Might be injured or disoriented. I'm going to step out and check." She exited the squad car, the drizzle lightly peppering her uniform. With each footstep on the wet asphalt, she tried not to make any sudden moves. The owl was so small, likely a screech owl, she guessed, though she wasn't entirely sure. As she neared, the bird blinked a few times but didn't take off. Most healthy owls would have flown away at the first approach. "Hey there, buddy," Sarah murmured, crouching a few feet away. She noticed the owl's left wing droop oddly. That was definitely not normal. "You're hurt, huh?" "It's okay. I'm here to help." Careful not to scare it, she stood up and popped the trunk of her car. A soft flannel jacket was one of the spare items she kept around for roadside emergencies. While this was more commonly used for comforting accident victims in shock, it would work just as well for a frightened, injured bird. With the jacket folded in her arms, Sarah approached again. The owl's small body tensed, but it didn't move. Slowly, she draped the flannel over the creature and gently scooped it up. It fluttered frantically for a moment, sharp talons scraping the inside of the jacket, but calmed when it realized it wasn't in immediate danger. Sarah cradled the small, trembling bundle against her chest. A pang of sympathy shot through her. A wild animal that usually avoided humans at all costs was now placing its fate in her hands. "Well," she said, barely above a whisper, "you just changed my plans for the evening. Let's see if we can find you some help." Back inside the cruiser, Sarah gently set the owl, still wrapped in flannel, on the passenger seat. She angled the dashboard light so it wouldn't shine directly on it, hoping to minimize stress. Rain pattered against the windshield. "Dispatch, Officer Rogers here." She spoke into the radio, keeping her voice calm. "I'm going to need a few minutes to handle this owl situation. Could you confirm any open calls that need immediate attention?" The dispatcher, Logan, responded. "Rogers, no active calls at the moment. The suspicious vehicle near Westbrook Park checked out. Turns out it was just an out-of-towner who got lost. You're free to handle that, but keep me updated." Breathing a soft sigh of relief, Sarah thanked him. She had a memory from her childhood flash through her mind. A time her father, a dedicated Riverfalls police officer before retirement, brought home a wounded bird. She was maybe 9 years old, and her dad, broad-shouldered and gentle, had shown her how to give the bird warmth and a safe place to rest until they could get it to a wildlife center. That memory always stuck with her, especially since losing her mother at a young age. Her dad had done his best to instill compassion in her despite the hardships they faced. While Sarah gazed at the little owl, flashes of that childhood lesson mingled with a more recent, painful memory. The day she arrived too late to save a stray puppy that had been hit by a speeding car. She had found it trembling in the middle of the road, helpless. By the time she had rushed it to a local vet, the puppy passed away in her arms. Never again, she had told herself. I won't just stand by if I have the power to help. Determined to do right this time, Sarah recalled that there was a small wildlife rescue center about 30 miles outside Riverfalls, along the back roads leading to Redwood County. A woman named Mrs. Margaret Clark ran it almost single-handedly, with help from volunteers and occasional grants. Word around town was that if you found an injured bird or small mammal, Mrs. Clark was your go-to. Sarah made a quick call to the station's direct line, explaining she planned to drive the owl there, provided nothing urgent arose. Though the department lacked a formal policy for wildlife rescues, most officers were allowed some discretion in non-emergency situations. Still, part of Sarah worried about the reaction she'd get, especially from her supervisor, Sergeant Bennett. He was known for being a by-the-book guy who frowned upon any detours from official protocol. Nevertheless, her mind was made up. All right, little friend, she said, glancing at the owl. Buckle up. We've got to drive ahead. She started the engine and pulled away, guiding her cruiser carefully along the slick roads. The patter of rain on the roof created a soothing rhythm. Every so often, the owl shuffled beneath the jacket, letting out a faint sound that tore at Sarah's heartstrings. She flicked on the car's heater, hoping some warmth might ease the bird's stress. Despite the calmness in the car, Sarah's thoughts raced. She thought about her father, lying in a hospital room a few hours away, dealing with complications from an old back injury that never properly healed after decades on the force. She recalled the tension at the last family visit, his stubborn insistence that she focus on her job, rather than taking too much time off to care for him. You have to do what's best for others, Sarah, he'd said. Keep living. Don't spend your days worrying about me. She brushed away the pang of guilt. Right now, doing what's best meant saving this helpless creature. Maybe it was her way of honoring the lessons her dad had instilled in her all those years ago. The drive to Mrs. Clark's Wildlife Rescue Center took Sarah down rural highways lined with pine trees and quiet farmland. Occasional deer darted through the brush, illuminated for a split second by her headlights. A cluster of antique shops and roadside motels marked the outskirts of Redwood County, but by midnight, all was dark and shuttered. Eventually, Sarah spotted the wooden sign for the rescue center, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. She turned onto a gravel driveway that led to a modest house and a series of outbuildings. A dim security light cast a hazy glow over the property. Pulling up to a chain-link gate, she left her cruiser's headlights shining on the gravel and stepped out, trying not to slip. She found a buzzer and pressed it. After a pause that felt endless, a porch light clicked on and the front door opened a crack. Through the gap, she saw a woman with short, gray hair, wrapped in a robe. Mrs. Clark. Yes, the woman called, sounding both cautious and exhausted. Sarah raised a hand in greeting. I'm Officer Sarah Rogers from Riverfalls PD. Sorry to come by so late, but I've got a small owl with what looks like a hurt wing. The door opened wider. An owl? Mrs. Clark repeated. Her tone changed to concern laced with a practiced calm. Bring it in, dear. Bring it in. Just mind the step. Sarah gently lifted the bundle from her car, feeling the owl shift inside. She followed Mrs. Clark into a cozy living room that also served as a sort of triage space. The walls were lined with photos and sketches of birds, hawks, owls, egrets, even a few smaller songbirds. A faint smell of disinfectant mingled with the scent of brewed tea. They navigated to a large wooden table near the back of the room. Mrs. Clark switched on a lamp that threw warm light across the space. Let's see our patient, she said. Sarah unveiled the owl, careful not to startle it. The bird blinked under the sudden brightness, trembling slightly. Mrs. Clark's expression softened. She gently touched the owl's wing with practiced hands. I've seen a few of these little screech owls around. They can be surprisingly hardy, but a car strike or a fall could do some real harm. She probed the wing gently, feeling for fractures. No obvious break. Probably bruising or a mild sprain. We can handle that. Relief washed over Sarah. Thank goodness, she murmured, suddenly aware of how tense her shoulders were. Is there anything else we should do right away? Mrs. Clark nodded. I'll get it into a quiet enclosure with some soft bedding. Keep it warm. Tomorrow, I'll drive it to Dr. Levitt, our volunteer vet. She knows birds inside and out. For tonight, you did the right thing. It's good you didn't just leave it. A swirl of gratitude welled up in Sarah, but she also felt a twinge of anxiety. She'd have to explain this detour to Sergeant Bennett and log it in an official report. As if sensing her thoughts, Mrs. Clark gave her a knowing smile. I have some paperwork, standard protocol. We document the date, time, location, condition, and the finder's details. That way, if wildlife officials ask, we have a record. Sarah sighed, but not out of reluctance. She was used to forms. The job demanded meticulous records, after all. That's fine. Let's get it done, she said, rolling up her sleeves. Half an hour later, once the forms were completed, Sarah helped Mrs. Clark settle the owl into a temporary cage lined with towels and straw. The older woman placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. I appreciate that people like you still care. You'd be surprised how often I find animals left outside my gate with no explanation. Before heading out, Sarah noticed a battered photo pinned to a bulletin board. Mrs. Clark, decades younger, holding a large hawk with a bandaged wing. She realized that this woman had likely dedicated most of her life to caring for injured wildlife. It gave her a sense of comfort, knowing the owl would be in such capable hands. She said her goodbyes, promising to check in. Outside, the night air bit a little colder, but her heart felt warmer. The drive back to the station was quiet, no calls on the radio. She wondered if she'd get an earful from Bennett in the morning. In the rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of her own weary eyes. I did the right thing, she told herself. That's what matters. Sarah arrived back at the Riverfalls station around 2 a.m. The place was as still as a graveyard, with just a single overhead light illuminating the parking lot. Inside, the fluorescent lights of the bullpen revealed a handful of night officers typing reports or sipping stale coffee. A mild hush fell as she walked in, cradling her duty belt. Some gave her curious looks. Dispatch Officer Logan waved her over. So, how'd it go? He asked quietly. You managed to help that owl? Sarah nodded. Took it to Mrs. Clark's rescue center. She seems optimistic. Logan gave a small grin. That's good. Wish more people would do that kind of thing. Oh, heads up, Sergeant Bennett's not too pleased you left your patrol route. He told me to let you know to see him first thing. She stifled a groan. Understood. Just then, another familiar face emerged from a side office. Officer Michael Stanton, a tall, easygoing man roughly Sarah's age. He joined the department around the same time she did. Heard you got a new partner for a bit, he joked gently. Feathered, I take it? Word travels fast, Sarah muttered, half smiling. Michael shrugged. Small town. People talk. But hey, I think it's admirable. If you need any backup with Bennett, I can vouch for you. Sarah smiled at the offer, but doubted it would make much difference. I appreciate that, Michael, she said. He's just going to remind me that the job comes first, that we're not running a pet rescue. I know the drill. Before leaving, Sarah typed up a brief incident note for the record. Date, time, location, the presence of an injured owl, the reason for her departure from standard patrol, and how she transferred the bird to a recognized rescue facility. The department was big on paper trails. She had no illusions about the mild scolding she'd receive later, but at least the facts were on file. At dawn, her shift ended. She crawled into bed and slept fitfully for a few hours until her phone buzzed with a text from the station. Sergeant wants a meeting at 2 p.m. Perfect. She rubbed the sleep from her eyes, put on a clean uniform, and drove back, bracing for the conversation. Sergeant Bennett's office was modest, a few plaques on the walls from his years of service, and a neat stack of paperwork on his desk. He greeted Sarah with a curt nod, gesturing for her to sit. Rogers, he began in his low, measured voice. I read your report about the owl. Sarah swallowed. Yes, sir. He eyed her carefully. Is that an effective use of police resources? She took a breath. I believe the owl was seriously injured. Had I left it, it would have likely died from exposure or a passing vehicle. We had no emergent calls at the time, and I notified dispatch of my location. I did everything by the book except, well, focusing my patrol time on something outside typical calls. But I stand by the decision. Bennett tapped a pen against a folder on his desk. For a moment, he looked torn between annoyance and something akin to respect. Rogers, you have a strong sense of duty. To the community, to living creatures. I understand that, but let's keep this in perspective. In a bigger city, you'd be chewed out for leaving your assigned post. Yes, sir, Sarah repeated, trying to remain polite. A heavy pause. Then Bennett sighed. I'm not writing you up. Consider this a warning, though. Next time, coordinate with dispatch more comprehensively. That's all. Relief washed over Sarah, and she nodded. Thank you, sir. I'll be more thorough in the future. She stood and left, feeling a mixture of gratitude and frustration. It could have gone far worse. Out in the hallway, Michael waited, leaning against the wall with arms crossed. Judging by your face, I'm guessing you didn't get fired, he teased. Not even a suspension, she shot back, allowing a grin. He basically said, don't do it again. Michael patted her shoulder. Glad to hear it. Hey, you heading to Mrs. Clark's later to check on that owl? My shift ends soon. I could drive us there in my truck if you'd like. She hesitated, thinking of her father's hospital bills and the errands she needed to run, but then nodded. I'd appreciate that. Let's go see how our little friend is doing. Around 4 p.m., Michael's blue pickup rattled along the same gravel path Sarah had driven the night before. The October sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the property. Mrs. Clark greeted them at the gate, a warm smile lighting her features. Come in, come in. I've got news on our patient. They followed her into a small outbuilding that served as an interim shelter for recovering birds. Enclosures of various sizes lined the walls, each labeled with the species inside and notes on medication, feeding schedules, or injuries. Sarah's heart thumped a little faster when Mrs. Clark guided them to a large wire enclosure near a corner window. Perched on a low branch inside was the tiny screech owl. A bandage wrapped gently around its left wing, but otherwise, it looked more alert than the night before. Its bright eyes tracked their movement. A quiet sense of wonder filled the air. He's definitely perked up, Mrs. Clark said, resting a hand on the enclosure. The vet was here this morning, said it's a mild sprain. He'll need about a week or two of gentle rest, then more checkups. If all goes well, we can release him. Sarah crouched to get a better view, a soft smile tugging at her lips. That's fantastic news. Michael leaned in, studying the owl. So, it's a screech owl, right? Mrs. Clark nodded. Yes, a western screech owl, though some variations exist. They're fairly common in some parts of Oregon, but it's not unusual for them to wander off their territory, especially younger ones. Bad weather or a disorientation can lead to accidents. Sarah found herself transfixed by the little bird. Its tufted ears were barely visible, and it gripped the perch with surprisingly strong talons. It's amazing how resilient they can be, she mused. Just last night, I wasn't sure if it'd even make it. Mrs. Clark gave her a reassuring look. You saved it, Officer Rogers. It would have been run over, or a predator might have snatched it on the road. You did a good thing. They spent the next half hour discussing the owl's feeding requirements, small pieces of mice, mostly, and the plan for gradual wing therapy. Mrs. Clark's manner of describing the process was so gentle and thorough that Sarah couldn't help feeling immense respect. Meanwhile, Michael took a few photos on his phone, promising to print them out for Sarah so she'd have a memento. Later, they wandered to the outdoor pens for larger birds, hawks and falcons that had survived collisions or gunshot wounds. The center was modest, funded largely by donations. Sarah saw the well-worn state of the equipment and realized Mrs. Clark's dedication came at a personal cost. She felt a stirring desire to help, but that was a conversation for another day. They thanked Mrs. Clark and promised to return soon. Back in the truck, Michael turned to Sarah with a thoughtful expression. You know, this might sound sappy, but I think you did more than rescue a bird. You showed everyone on the force that compassion still matters. Sarah's cheeks warmed. I hope so. Sometimes it feels like we're just ticking boxes, writing up reports. But moments like this remind me there's a soul to this job. Michael nodded. Exactly. Over the following week, Sarah balanced her patrol duties and personal life with regular check-ins at the center. Each time, the owl seemed a bit livelier, inching up branches, testing its wing. Though she tried not to get too attached, she couldn't help feeling an emotional bond to the bird that had, in its own way, reminded her of her life's purpose. Meanwhile, news of her rescue spread quietly around the station. A couple of fellow officers teased her good-naturedly. Hey, bird lady, they'd joke as she passed by. But others offered genuine kudos or even asked for updates. Even Sergeant Bennett seemed to ease up, rarely mentioning the incident unless it was in passing. Sarah suspected that part of him respected her sense of compassion, though he'd never say it aloud. One particularly busy night shift, Sarah got a phone call from the hospital where her father was staying. The nurse informed her he'd had a minor complication but was stable. After the relief of knowing he was okay, Sarah found her thoughts drifting to the owl. Both her father and the bird were on the mend, fighting their own battles. She promised herself she'd visit her dad the moment she had enough off days accumulated. Finally, about 10 days after the initial rescue, Mrs. Clark called Sarah with exciting news. "He's ready to go," she announced cheerfully. "You want to help with the release?" Sarah's heart leapt. "Absolutely. Tell me when." They settled on an evening at twilight, when screech owls naturally become active. Sarah arrived at the rescue center in her personal car, out of uniform. Michael tagged along, curious to witness the event. A few volunteers from the center also gathered, forming a small circle in the field behind the main house. The autumn sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bands of pink and orange. Mrs. Clark stepped out with a medium-sized carrier in hand. Sarah could sense the bird's restless movement inside, as though it knew freedom was near. Everyone grew quiet in that soft twilight hush. Taking a calming breath, Mrs. Clark opened the carrier door. At first, the owl hesitated, perched on the edge. Then it hopped out onto the grass, blinking in the fading light. Sarah felt her chest tighten, an odd mix of nerves and excitement. Would it really fly? Almost as if on cue, the owl flexed its once-injured wing, looked around, and with a quiet flutter, lifted off the ground. In a quick burst of motion, it landed on a nearby fence post, stared back at them for an intense second, then launched itself into the air, disappearing into the dark silhouettes of the trees beyond. The group stood silent, reverent. A wave of goosebumps prickled Sarah's arms. "That," Mrs. Clark said softly, "is exactly why we do what we do." Sarah blinked back, tears she hadn't realized were forming. She recalled her father's words about compassion and how small acts of kindness can ripple out in ways we never fully see. A gentle warmth filled her, like she'd found a missing piece of herself in this quiet farmland release. Michael patted her on the back. "Well done, Officer Rogers," he teased, voice thick with genuine emotion. She laughed quietly, wiping her eyes. "Thanks. And thank you, Mrs. Clark. Couldn't have done it without you." They lingered a while longer, chatting softly, the last slivers of sunlight fading into the star-studded night. When it was time to leave, Sarah felt lighter than she had in weeks. The worry about her father, the constant tension at work, all of it paled compared to the simple, beautiful moment she had just witnessed. That night, she called her dad, who was still in the hospital. She told him every detail of the owl's release. Though his voice was weak, she heard pride in his words. "I always knew you had a heart for helping, Sarah. Don't let this job, or this world, take that away from you." "I won't, Dad," she whispered. "I promise." So ends the expanded story of how a tiny owl blocked a police patrol's path one stormy night, only to be rescued by a determined young officer whose compassion rose above protocol. It's a testament to how even the smallest gestures can leave a profound impact, inspiring hope and reminding us that empathy is central to our shared humanity. And remember, subscribe to my YouTube channel for more real-life stories that might just bring a tear to your eye. Because sometimes, in the hustle of our busy lives, it's the tiniest creatures, and the simplest acts of kindness, that remind us what being human is truly all about.